Hi, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of Autoheterophiles, the podcast where we talk about autosexuality with the people who experience it. And today I'm here with Jackie. So thanks for coming on the show, Jackie.
Yep, no problem. So did
To, um, yeah, I guess a good place to start might be, why were you interested in coming on the show?
yeah, so I guess my sort of I guess a bit of an introduction. My name's Jackie. I am a 20-year-old, 1-year-old autosexual male, and then I've taken the identity of a woman. Sort of why I wanted to come on the show is I feel like I kind of have a unique view on sort of autosexuality as sort of a early because a lot of the time I feel in this sort of discourse, a lot of people who sort of have more sort of explicit or who are sort of more have sort of weaker sort of autosexuality will come kind of talk about it, and then sort of people who don't really are I know you've had like other people on here, but sort of I kind of wanted to sort of speak about my specific experience as like a transitioning autosexual.
Yeah, when did you start transitioning?
So socially, I'd say around 15. That's kind of when I told my friends and my parents. And around then, I started like cross dressing publicly. So I'd like wear skirts and stuff to school. And then around sort of when I moved out of my parents' house at like 18, I would start medically transitioning. Um, when I have that more freedom, I'd start medically transitioning. And then so I've done that for the past 3 years.
And in hindsight, um, I guess can you discuss some of your childhood? Like when did the gender feelings start and what were they?
So I guess to like orient my childhood, I'd say it kind of started or around like 9. It wasn't like explicitly sort of dysphoric, I guess, but I did have those sorts of feelings where like um, I'd like get caught up in these daydreams where I thought I would sort of develop into a woman, if that makes sense. Um, I
Yeah.
wasn't sort of like consciously, I was sort of intellectually, I guess, aware that, I would sort of develop into a man. But sort of like I'd get caught up in those sorts of delusions and like fantasies where like I guess having like a magic disease or something like that. And then sort of I guess puberty, I guess, is sort of when that started getting ramped up. Um, I think or it was around then where I sort of experienced like disgust, I guess, like autoandrophobia.
Yeah.
Like I think 12ish was I sort of had those feelings where like I didn't sort of like what I was turning into, and it felt like a sort of a weird sort of body horror experience, I guess. Um, and so like when I turned 15, I guess the one of the things I feel like autoandrophobia sort of does to you is like, and I feel this is kind of where a lot of like gender activists sort of come in, is like born in the wrong body. I feel like a lot of the times if you have that sort of disgust with yourself, it does really feel that way, and it did to me. Like I was going through some sort of like body horror, I guess. And so like 15, I sort of decided to like I wanted to take on the identity of a woman. Um,
With the autoandrophobia, like what specific manifestations did you have?
so I guess I think it was a bit different before, like from like sort of before I, decided transition was an option and after. There are some people who sort of talk about like, my dysphoria got worse. And I feel like for me, sort of, I did have sort of disgust with like certain parts of my body in terms of like proportions and hair was like a big one, and also sort of like the shape of my face, I guess. But I didn't really, throughout puberty, I was sort of like Googling and stuff like that, like about, transgender. Like when I was 12, for example, I sort of Googled like transgender stuff, but it didn't really feel like, because I do sort of, I still like felt like a man, I guess, just like developing in that sort of way where I was kind of unhappy with. So I guess, and at that point, it was mostly like I didn't sort of like the way that I would looked and sort of the way that I, foresaw that I was supposed to look, and also certain like, general stuff like that. When I sort of decided to transition, I guess, it wasn't like the disgust like sort of amplified. I felt like it was more so that felt like, I had like a specific target. Like this is something I can sort of turn into. Um, and after that point, I kind of felt like, in that sense, like, um, sort of, like obviously there is like the autoandrophobia, but there's also sort of the idealization that sort of I think came in there.
Yeah. So did you have a clear image in your mind of what you wanted to become?
Um, I think like a attractive, I guess, women, I guess. Nowadays, I think that's sort of changed. But when I was sort of starting on that, and the pink bubble and stuff like that, I was like, I want to be this sort of like attractive woman, I guess.
When you first came out with social transition, how did the people in your life respond to it?
So I guess my friends before, like high school and stuff like that, they were under the assumption that there was something going on. So like some people thought I was like gay or bi or something. My parents were not at all supportive. Um, yeah, and I do sort of understand it because looking back, that is something I was like sort of an atypical child, but I feel like those specific gender feelings I feel to them would sort of come out of nowhere, since that, I guess, the body issues or stuff, I'd kind of keep to myself.
Right. Yeah, it often comes as a surprise to parents because so much
Mhm.
of that you'd keep to yourself, and then when you do finally bring it up, it's they might just be
Yeah.
confused because as a little child you didn't show any signs to them.
I did get sort of bullied for being feminine, but I don't think that's like an actual sort of manifestation there, of like me like exerting that kind of behavior, I guess. So as like a kid, um, my family is for like religious reasons. We had like a vegetarian diet. And part of that was I like sort of go and like play with these kids at like across the street, um, and like part of that was like I would sort of get made fun of for that and called like like a sissy and stuff like that. Also, sort of the way I screamed, that read to people as like feminine, I guess. And like I guess like generally just being like atypical in terms of like less social, I guess, that kind of painted like a target on me. So there were those sorts of like bullying, but I guess looking back on it, I don't think it was like something where it was like particularly like feminine, I guess, just more something that's like forced, I guess.
Yeah. And did you start transitioning as soon as you turned 18 in terms of medically?
As soon as I left the house. So in terms of,
Yeah.
I sort of ordered that from like the DIY people, I guess.
Yeah. That's the most direct way to go about doing it.
Yeah.
Um, are you so you're 3 years into transition right now. Are
Mhm.
you how are you feeling about it? Like, are you sure that it's the right thing?
I Okay, there's a couple ways I think I'd kind of approach this. First, I guess so after medically sort of getting into it, first like year and a half was sort of I'd characterize as like in my pink bubble, I guess, as like other people would put it, where it was like there was like sort of the excitement of like I kind of felt like I was saved from turning into like like an adult man, I suppose. I
Yeah.
like yeah. And so I was sort of free to sort of like um, have that identity. But I think as now I guess last like year and a half, I've sort of come into that stage where like that initial sort of excitement has kind of worn off. I don't plan on necessarily like detransition, but there is like a thing that kind of hits you where it's like I feel like when you sort of start transition, like one of the first things you kind of get told is that you don't actually become like a cisgender woman, and that's something that sort of like a I understood that like sort of emotionally, or not emotionally. I did not understand that emotionally.
Like,
I under
intellectually?
Yeah, intellectually I sort of understood that, but I don't emotionally I kind of felt like that would be something that would be sort of good enough, I suppose. Um and I feel like recently I've sort of had to I've sort of uh, I guess come to sort of emotionally come to that, and it is something that's kind of unpleasant to sort of realize. But I do feel like emotionally I've sort of come to that where, and so I'm kind of stuck in like this awkward position where like I don't want to sort of be in a position where I'm clockable sometimes. I want to sort of, if I were to sort of adopt the identity of a woman, sort of be in a position where, I guess, like, as like other people have put it, like, I want to be able to, no longer be able to pass as a man, I guess. But that is sort of just the situation because, like, I'm like woman presenting to the people around me, and also sort of the realization that you don't actually the sort of emotional realization there it really sort of like puts like a wrench in sort of the idea you have of yourself in the future, because like for me nowadays it's sort of kind of evolved into like more severe, I guess, dysphoria where it's like for me it's like I do it's like a deep sort of like whenever I go to sleep and stuff like that, it's sort of like a deep, if it's like, there's like this fantasy in my head of like a different life and sort of a wish that I could just like sort of pass into that, if that makes sense. So I feel like in terms of like sort of that emotional sort of thing, that's gotten a lot worse, I guess. And I do sort of wish that I could go back into the closet, if that makes sense, and like stay medically sort of transitioning.
I see. Like, unless you were able to pass, like, completely all the time, it almost
Mhm, or
feels like
unless unable to pass as a man, right? Because I guess for me, it's like I sort of see what people say about like autosexuals and and like it really does sort of feel sometimes like people are like grossed out by you, I suppose.
being in the in-between zone, like,
Mhm,
for some people, someone that's transitioned and sort of
mhm,
seems in between sexes, it kinda triggers their, like, uncanny valley sort of
mhm, definitely.
disgust response, and yeah. But, okay, so you're pretty satisfied with the medical aspect of it then?
I wouldn't say it's just for me, it's sort of I'm running away from masculinizing, if that makes there are certain things I don't want to happen to me, because like imagining it does feel like some sort of strange body horror.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, how did you learn about autogynephilia and autosexuality?
I you've had Dakota on your show, right?
Yeah, did you learn from her?
Yeah, I read it. So a friend of mine, it's on this like radical feminism sort of Discord server. Like a month or like a couple, a month ago, she sort of sent me her article on like an empathetic approach to autogenophilia or portrayal of autogenophilia. If you've read that,
Is it
but
the not like the other boys
yes, exactly,
one?
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's something that, like, really spoke to me in terms of, like, analloeroticism and the sort of, like, not truly being able to sort of connect with others, but, nonetheless, having, like, sort of a romantic idea of yourself. And that sort of drove me because before I was kind of in these like 4chan spaces where it was like not necessarily like Blanchardism as like it was like this sort of pop Blanchardism where you have this like true trans type and then you have these like fetishists and like cultural transitioners like like the HSTS people. And sort of
Yeah.
that sort of article really sort of brought me into, I guess, the academic kind of perspective of it, which was where you sort of have, it is like a spectrum, and you have people who are more strongly sort of emotionally attached to the idea of themselves as a woman, and you have people who are sort of, less so, maybe sort of attached to the idea of themselves as like a um as like as like a fuda whatever, or like a
Like
y-
she-male, like a woman
yeah,
with a
exactly.
dick sort of thing.
Yeah, those sorts of like porn terms, I suppose. Um, I don't know. For me, and then I guess I spoke to the friend who sort of recommended me the article. And she is like a cis woman who's like really into like Blanchardism and like specific sorts of feminism, I guess. But she basically directed me to like a server where I could talk to the author, I guess. So I did sort of like talk to her for a bit, and she sort of recommended me Anne Lawrence's literature.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's sort of where I got, because for me, there were definitely sort of like sometime it wasn't really central as like a driver for my decisions, but like there was sort of that feeling of yeah, I guess there were that sort of like underlying eroticism that I was like very ashamed of. Um, but it was there, I guess. And and like that sort of like this thing that like, and but my I still do feel like my primary driver is like a romantic sort of attraction. So I guess you asked me the
Is it
question earlier
like a
about.
romantic attraction to being a woman?
Yeah, I'd say so. I guess when I was sort of talking about those daydreams and stuff like that, one of the ones would be like, are you familiar? I wasn't really exposed to these terms, so I wasn't thinking about it this way. But those like sort of DID people on like Discord who will like make
Yeah.
OCs. Yeah, no, I kind of felt like, what if I sort of did that and like had like a woman in my head that could sort of like switch out, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like a separate, like a woman alt, like
Hmm.
headmate that you could switch spaces with.
Yeah, I sort of felt, that was something that was sort of like attractive to me, and sort of being able to sort of embody that, I guess, in a more like I got that was something that was sort of like really I don't know, that was something I wanted to like go towards, I guess, as like a kid. I never, I don't think that's possible, and I didn't think that was possible as a kid, but that was sort of like a daydream I had. So I guess that sort of like romantic sort of drive toward it, that was something that really resonated with me. because a lot of these sort of Blanchardist, I guess, spaces are like, or like on 4chan, are like really try hard to make the distinction between people who are actually dysphoric and like people who just have a fetish, which I know now, I guess, to not be the case.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I'd say the ones that have the worst dysphoria are the autogynephilic type.
hmm
And
I mean, I'd say they're, I guess, more autosexual than like, because like I feel like people who have less dysphoria are, they're likely to have more likely to sort of have relationships with other people, which I
yeah.
think is like the key. Auto and allosexuality is sort of like you exist on a spectrum somewhere there.
When you heard about like the DID people,
Mhm.
did any of their experiences seem relatable or similar to other trans experiences you'd seen described?
No, but I didn't really do that big of like a research dive into them. So I guess from my sort of perspective, it really felt like people who had like original characters sort of wanted to role play as them. And I was really into role playing in like middle school. There's like some games I'd play on, and like some chat rooms where play make believe, but it really sort of felt like they were sort of doing that sort of a thing, and I never really took them seriously, and I still kind of don't. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think thinking back on it, that's just like sort of like I guess like a thing that I can sort of use to communicate that experience of like wanting to share like a headmate, I guess.
Yeah. Did um did you so yeah, it sounds like you learned about this because of Dakota.
hmm
Um and
Well, I was
yeah,
always
she's
sort of into
yeah.
those like 4chan, where AGP sort of gets tossed around as like mudslinging, I suppose. But
Right. What because pretty much every male to female person on there is AGP. Like the
Mhm.
HSTS aren't hanging around on an internet message board. That's
I
not.
I my
Yeah.
my theory, I guess, is that like at least in the West, that like sort of HSTS transsexuals don't really exist. Because my impression of them now is sort of like if you're HSTS, you're sort of like non dysphoric, but like it's like the role you kind of get forced into. So, like, I guess one example would be like sort of an Iranian gay man who sort of has to transition, is like the thing I think of. But in like the West, I feel like a lot of like sort of feminine gay kids get defeminized rather than like pushed into the role of women. And it's sort of also more acceptable to be a gay man, if that makes sense, as like an adult. So I do feel, and like I do feel like no HSTS sort of survives contact with the internet.
Yeah, I do think that in the West, um, that basically the HSTS is super rare because,
hmm
like you said, they instead of getting forced into being female, they'll get or defeminized during puberty, as you put it, and also society is so accepting of homosexuality these days, where
hmm
it just doesn't seem like the payoff would be nearly as high as it used to be.
Yeah. I don't know. I did make a joke out there that like somewhere out there, one of like the last five homosexual transsexuals is like out there thinking that they're like a meta attracted AGP or something like that. So
Yeah, it's yeah, 4chan it has it has done a lot to spread word about the typology,
hmm
and it's unfortunate that the way that 4chaners talk, it's always to basically shit on AGPs,
hmm
even though they pretty much are AGPs.
yeah.
So, but due to the free speech norms of that site, it just it's been an incredibly powerful vector for spreading these ideas.
I do think that sort of I do sort of I suppose you would also agree with me, but like I do sort of think that there is sort of a need to sort of reclaim the term, I suppose, because not only do
Yeah.
like sort of other AGPs sort of use it as like a mudslinging, but also like a lot of I do feel like a lot of sort of gender critical people sort of use the term to refer to like trans people they don't like or sort of like um, paint all autogenophiles or like autosexuals as like these monstrous misogynistic men, which I don't really think is I don't think is like super accurate, I guess. um,
Right, because a lot of them are like admire women greatly,
mhm.
which is like the opposite of being misogynistic.
Yeah, I definitely say, for me at least, my friend group, I guess, was primarily, women, I guess, and so like, a lot of, I did sort of rely on them a lot for like help when I was like first coming out on sort of like what is like not like aesthetic things and like some sort of like etiquette things.
Right, like fashion and makeup and etiquette.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the things I kind of like so there's like a tendency I feel for, when autosexuals sort of first come out to sort of wear really like I guess so, like socially inappropriate stuff.
Yeah, like really over the top stuff.
Yeah, I didn't fall into that, but I did have like I I wouldn't say it's over the top, but I did have like one or two like articles of like feminine clothing that really didn't fit with like outfits or anything. I just like wear them to school, and like in hindsight I feel really awkward about it. But I guess nowadays I sort of feel that that's just like a part of being um I guess that's just like a part of my sexuality as and I wasn't like super I don't think it was like super objectionable because I wasn't like trying to be like this I get like I wasn't sort of trying to sort of emulate, I guess, like sexually that you see with a lot of people who are like really into like transgender corn, I guess. um
Yeah, like you're trying to keep it kind of tasteful.
Yeah, I suppose. And I guess nowadays I've sort of gotten like really into like specific sort of like fashion. I guess just like the systematizing of it, which has kind of helped me like plan out outfits and that sort of thing. Which appeal to me and also like are like socially acceptable, I guess.
Yeah, do you have just sort of like a formula that you follow with outfits now?
Yeah, I do. In terms of like, I do like the. Are you familiar? Are you sort of familiar with like kibbe types at all?
With what types?
Kibbe?
No, but you can talk about it. I'll figure it out.
Oh, no, it's like sort of like I guess for like most sort of like mainstream. I don't want to say mainstream. Like a lot of like fashion advice is sort of based around sort of the shape of your body, right? So they'll do like the measurements of they'll do like the measurements of your hip, your waist, and like your bust size or whatever. Kibbe specifically is like sort of a fashion philosophy around sort of the mood of like your body type rather than like specific measurements. So like it'll sort of talk about I guess do you have like a more like dramatic sort of mood as a person? So for me as like a tall like person, it's sort of I'm sort of like a uh my mood would be like dramatic natural, right? So it's sort of um the more like masculine features, so sort of clothes that kind of balance out that sort of because I have like a really long vertical, clothes that sort of balance that out, and also the more sort of angular features. um, I guess, that I have as like a natal male.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, just learning to dress for your body type.
Yeah, I suppose.
Um, do you have you ever been diagnosed with autism spectrum?
I have not. I suspect it, but I wouldn't. I don't. I have not been diagnosed with autism or anything like that.
But you suspect that you have
Maybe. I think
some
it's
of the traits.
possible. Yeah. In terms, I do find myself like, or not necessarily. I do find myself sort of really into that sort of systematizing. Also, like autism is going to be sort of correlated with paraphilias, which, autosexuality is something which is non-hetero. It's like it is a paraphilia. It's not like heterosexual or whatever,
Yeah.
or like all heterosexual, which.
Yeah. Have you encountered um do you encounter other trans people in real life?
There's a handful at my so I do have like a couple sort of stories about that. There is at my sort of at my unit. So I go to a like fairly conservative university. Um, but basically, there's like a trans org like here that I was in for like a week, but they were like really strict about sort of being a safe space to the point where like if you like post a picture of a butterfly, that's bugs, and some people are like sort of offended by that, and you're not allowed to do that. But this was like a couple years ago, and I asked about like weight cycling, and they banned me for like asking about it. But based on
Yeah.
some other sort, based on some things I've sort of heard about the organization, I'm sort of glad to not be there. There are
Right. It
sort of,
it becomes so
Mhm.
safe that it's actually unsafe.
Yeah, definitely. There are, and then I guess there's like a handful of other people I sort of know of. I'll occasionally make like sort of like that. There's like one of my friend, and we sort of work on like because I'm like a STEM major, and we work on like a sort of technical sort of project together. So like occasionally, because like I know and like she knows I am like trans and stuff. So we sometimes make like Blanchard related jokes to each other, which that's like, um, but sort of in real life, that's like mostly my exposure, I guess nowadays.
Yeah. Do you you hang out and interact with trans people online in Discord?
So online, I've tried to mostly, I guess interact more with like sorts of like cis women, I guess, which is fairly hard because like I have a specific interest set, but like those are like people that are out there, and those are people, I do have friends like that. Um, I know, but it's mostly the reason that is, because there's like a lot of issues that sort of come around with like interacting with trans people, I guess, online, where it's like a couple, occasionally you're going to have people who are going to be like weird to you in terms of like unwanted advances. um, but like, I guess I've tried to mostly sort of, and also sort of like the advantage of sort of interacting with women online is you sort of like kind of secondhand sort of learn to act more feminine, I guess, which is I guess for me, I have like a whole philosophy on like how to sort of integrate feminine, or if you're like trans and you want to sort of integrate more feminine behaviors, or even not, even if you're just if you're just like autogynephilic, and you want to sort of integrate more feminine behaviors, there's like a philosophy I sort of apply to that, but being around women certainly helps with that. Um,
What's your philosophy for integrating feminine behaviors?
so most of sort of what I see from like competent sort of AGPs is like they'll try to sort of mimic the women they see, in terms of like um, in terms of like body language and like sort of the ways they behave. And I feel like if you're not like as competent, um, that can come off as fake. And also, I don't feel like that is entirely super helpful for the AGP in question. Because like I feel like for them, they're sort of just like learning to adopt those behaviors without actually sort of there's no like understanding there. They're just being like mimics, I suppose. So for me, it's more of like adopting certain values that you'd like to sort of, and this also helps because it's something that's more natural, and I also think like as a person, it's sort of something that's sort of more beneficial to you. But like certain, just adopting certain, like if you want to be more feminine, you just sort of adopt like certain value, you try to learn certain values that you want to be more of, I guess. So like for if you want to be more empathetic, if you want to be more sort of like considerate to others, and you sort of like examine your own sorts of behaviors and try to like through that sort of like value based sort of adjusting your mindset, that I think that's something that's effective, that's ultimately not fake, and that's something I feel like that does improve you as a person. So like sort of like be more empathetic and like be more sorts of like considerate to others, I guess.
Right. So adopting the values rather than the specific behaviors themselves.
I do feel like behaviors are gonna like follow sometimes. Like if you like body language, especially, I feel there's sort of two components to like body language. One, I feel like if you want to walk feminine and that sort of thing, like if you take HRT, that's going to sort of and this is something I noticed, but it does like adjust the your weight distribution, and then that sort of sense, like you do end up walking and stuff like that. But in terms of like sort of like the way that you sort of interact with people, I guess one of the big things is like a lot of ag or I don't want to I guess a lot of sort of the I don't want to say all or most, but a lot of the sort of badly behaving AGPs will who are like sort of sexually aggressive, I don't not necessarily badly behaving, because like there is sorts of like versions of this behavior which is socially acceptable in men, but like sort of that like sort of aggressive sort of sexual behavior and like sort of like aggressive like that sort of thing, I feel is mitigated a lot by just being considerate and like learning to more sort of have like an understanding of like other people's experiences and like that sort of empathy for like not wanting to put people in like positions that they aren't really comfortable with.
Yeah, that sort of mindset would help with the integration into
Mhm,
society.
mhm.
Do you have any thoughts on transgender discourse or politics around it?
Yeah, definitely. I suppose so. I guess my general sort of I understand. So I guess like when I first sort of started, I would consider myself more on like, or when I was like 15, I guess I'd consider myself more on like this sort of gender ideology side of it. Um, cause like and for that, it's like the neurological intersex, you have the brains of women. So like, um, but I think that's ultimately sort of harmful for like women, people who sort of want to integrate or like not like assimilate, I guess. Cause like the understanding, that you don't sort of have to like adjust behaviors and that sort of thing, which I do feel like sort of a mindset, change is sort of kind of necessary. And also for like a lot, I don't think a lot of people it's in their best interest to sort of go down the transition to sort of be trans, I guess. I think it's a lot, for a lot of autogynophiles to, be men who sort of, adopt sort of like certain characteristics that, they value in women, like mindsets and like values, I guess, that they sort of value in women, and sort of like adjust like dress for like what's sort of appropriate, I guess. But like I guess my and then for I do have sort of like issues with the gender critical side too. Like I don't think that like, all sort of autosexuals are necessarily like that sort of like harmful, I guess. And it does like upset me a little bit because, as someone who sort of suffers from like that sort of extreme, it's like autoandrophobia. It isn't necessarily something that, I'd sort of I guess it's something that sort of makes me, so I feel like as like if you sort of are AGP, you're in a sense you're sort of alienated from women than if you're sort of like a heterosexual man. Because like in that sense, like, you're sort of navigating society as like, someone who's trying to sort of mimic the behavior, which is something, it's incredibly like sort of alienated, I feel. But like some more of I feel like a lot of people would sort of be better served by like an understanding of autosexuality and sort of what is the best path for them in terms of sort of like access to female spaces. That is something that I sort of like. um I think people there needs to be more sort of like a lot of people have sort of talked about like policy, that sort of thing, which I suppose that's an option because like there are like a lot of people who are barely sort of assimilated, and and clearly have that sort of male mindset of like, being like that sort of aggressive sort of sexuality, which I don't necessarily know is, for like that single sex space. But I do sort of think that like for me, like I do get like sort of stared at in the men's restroom, and I do like prefer those like single occupancy, I guess, restrooms and stuff like that. So it's sort of like a balancing act where I do feel like we would be better served by sort of like internal policing, I guess, of that, sort of like among and I do think regulation might sort of have a place in that, but I do think, and people need to sort of like make sure that you are going, you aren't like being sort of predatory there, and you aren't sort of going in there if the men's room is sort of like perfectly safe for you, I suppose. In terms of like pediatric transition, I'd say I lean towards sort of where Anne Lawrence, I guess, wrote about, where it's like if you have a kid who has like severe, I guess, progressive dysphoria, which will get worse sort of over time, that might be something you might want to consider early intervention on. But if you have someone who can integrate that identity into sort of like a male role, that is something which is going to better serve them. Um,
Yeah, that that's I definitely think that's a more reasonable way of approaching
mhm.
the issue of youth gender transition with AGPs. Like the ones that are sort of predestined to end up analloerotic and have really bad
Mhm.
dysphoria seem like potentially good candidates, but the ones that
I
have it more mild, it's like kind of risky.
Yeah, definitely. I guess for me, it's like there's a sort of. Have you seen I Saw the TV Glow or any that movie?
Not yet. I've seen a lot of discourse about it, but haven't watched it.
Okay, I won't spoil it for you and I guess the audience, but I guess I didn't sort of come away with the sort of. I don't think I came away with the like the, I guess, take that the director might have, I guess, intended, but I did sort of. my impression of that was, there for me, I feel like there's some sort of, and like for a lot of sort of kids with like, sort of analloerotic leaning autogenophilia, it is that sort of um like it is that sort of like severe sort of body horror that you kind of go through, knowing what you're sort of going to turn into. And I do feel like, and that's, that isn't, I don't think is something that kind of goes away, into adulthood. That's something that kind of like stays with you. And I do think, like, obviously, I do think like certain like kids would be sort of better served by like, learning to sort of be feminine men, I guess. But, other kids who have that sort of go through that body horror experience, it'd be, even if it's not sort of, you do become like, there are downsides with like being like a medical patient and like sort of interacting with society, sort of. I feel like dating and stuff, sorts of normative, sorts of societal is like always going to be a problem for like people with severe analytic leaning, I guess.
Yeah. Have you tried dating?
I've had like a couple like bad experiences, I guess, earlier, when I was like 18. And then I guess nowadays I've sort of trended towards being more cautious and I guess being like really picky, which I do feel like the dating experience as like an autogynephile, not necessarily even like a transitioning autogynephile, but also, as, someone who's AGP and sort of, not integrating or like even repressing, that can be sort of like a difficult experience. Um, did you want to sort of hear more or about?
Sure. Yeah. Any of your
Yeah.
thoughts? Anything you want to talk about?
I guess in terms of my dating history, it's I had I guess I would consider myself true bisexual. There is like the whole meta attraction discourse. The way I sort of feel about that is I think for a lot of trans women or who like identify as bisexual or like straight, it's like, or I wouldn't say straight, or a lot of trans women who identify as bisexual, they might come into it who are like, and they're like 20, 30, 40% attracted to men and sort of obviously they're, without sort of that meta aspect, but sort of that meta aspect bumps that, 20, 30, 40% up to like 40, 50, 60% attraction to men. And because for me, I did have sort of crushes on guys before, you know, the decision to transition. But I've always kind of been at odds with like the meta attraction aspect, I guess, because like I did sort of feel my attraction to guys sort of grow, with the fantasy of being, but I wasn't, sort of into that sort of like faceless man, sort of like idea. Um, but did you have anything you wanted
Yeah.
to say?
Have you with the guys? Have you do they the guy? Have you tried to date any guys?
Yeah, so I guess like pretty early on, I dated. I went on a single date with this one guy who was he kind of ghosted me after, which as a I think you might expect, but we went like ice skating or something. But he ghosted me after, and I was pretty upset because this was like as like an adult, this is like kind of the first time I like went on a date or whatever. We met on like a dating app or something. Um, but I guess after that, I sort of like went online and I ended up dating this one guy who was like kind of like an incel ish. And that was, I feel like that was like sort of purely, it was a mix, I feel, of like meta attraction, like just, and like also like desperation because, I'd just been, or because like I was also like at that point sort of obsessing over like one of the guys I sort of had a crush on in high school, and like I posted about him on it was pretty ugly. I posted about him on 4chan and someone like tracked him down and like messaged him, and it was I felt really like awkward about that. But after that I sort of ended up dating this one sort of like incelish guy from like the Netherlands. And that was, I don't know, that was pretty unsatisfying to me because like he'd only ever like talk for like e-sex, which that was something I was kind of uncomfortable. I don't know. I feel kind of uncomfortable about that in like hindsight, but it is what it is. Um, I
Yeah. Do you
guess.
think he was Gamp?
Yeah, definitely. Uh, no uncertainty about that. Yeah, he was pretty like really into that. I don't think he was the sort of GAMP to AGAMP sort of pipeline that you see, but he was definitely like GAMP, I'd say.
Yeah. Do you, which country do you live in?
I live in the United States. I'm originally from California, but I go to school in Texas. So that the relationship that I had with this guy from the Netherlands was long distance.
Right. Yeah, like an online thing.
Hmm. After that, I did sort of like date this one like I dated this. I wouldn't consider myself GAMP, but I did date this one trans woman for like a couple months. Um, and then like as I think she like or P I guess detransitioned after like sometime after we broke up. Have you seen that one like sort of artifacts chart where it's like a list of all the autosexual the artifacts that autogynophiles will have,
Uh, I think
and
so. The
and
one
one
that
of them
Rody
is
made.
like the one that who made? I'm not familiar with the maker.
Okay.
Just okay.
Um,
Um,
I think so. Yeah. Which one were
and one
you?
of them, which one? Could you repeat that? Sorry, I didn't.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say which one you were.
Oh no. I'd consider myself like somewhere between the first two, like straight woman and lesbian, I guess, or like bouncing between those at like various points of time. But I was gonna say, I think she was that like gay boy one, or he, I guess, was that like the one which was like the gay boy, and it's like that pseudo FTM substitution
Of like wanting to be like
of
a gay
wanting
trans
to
man.
or like wanting to be like that sort of like boy motor that you see, I guess, who like feminized man.
Yeah, it's interesting all the different types of artifacts that this can get channeled into.
Yeah. Anyways, I did, and then I guess that was like several like 2 years ago, and I've sort of been, I guess, not doing because like she did like fly over fair, and afterwards I did feel kind of yeah like I should have been sort of more sort of selective, but ever since then I've kind of been I'm like open to whatever opportunities I guess comes my way, but I'm not like actively sort of dating. Um,
Yeah. Have you dated a woman before?
like a cisgender woman?
Right. Yeah.
No, but I'd like to. I've been in like I guess a situationship as they call it. Um, I guess with one like online, she was in like LA. I did feel like she was sort of I do kind of want to date someone I guess who's like a little bit like internet autistic, if that makes sense. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Someone that's like very online.
or not like very, but like I don't know. She was very sweet, and I feel really bad about it. But like I don't. She just wasn't like I did. She was kind of too much of like we had very different like lifestyles and like visions for our futures, I guess. And so I didn't really see that I guess working out. So I was like, I did feel like I could have sort of let her down easier because like she was very sweet, and I did feel really bad about that. But that's kind of what happened. But other than that, I haven't. I'd like to. And I wouldn't. I think now I've come to the realization I'm not GAMP. It's like the primary dating pool for most AGPs, which is other trans women, is sort of out for me, which I think is kind of a shame, but that's just not something I'm really attracted to. But I'd like to date a sort of cisgender woman.
Yeah, but one that's like kind of a little bit autistic.
Yeah, so a little bit online.
Yeah. What do you study in school?
Computer science. It's very stereotypical.
Yeah,
Yeah.
super on brand.
Yeah, computer science. I sort of wish like it was less so. Because like there's like a lot of discourse about it being like a male sort of thing, but it is something I'm very good at, and I do enjoy sort of. If I had to choose again, I'd pick like math or physics, but I'm too far into my degree to do that.
That's
Um,
funny. If I would choose, I did physics and engineering, and if I could do
uh-huh.
it again, I would have picked programming
That's interesting. I don't know, because
just
like
for the money.
well, I feel like you can get into that as like a physics mate, because like physics in my mind is just like applied math.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I don't know. I feel like if I had to choose again, probably like math or physics, or maybe even like because like I've gotten really into like biology stuff like that. So like chemistry or something like that. Or like I briefly I guess wanted to do like politics stuff because that is like a hobbyist interest of mine. Not sort of like the extreme politics you see, I guess, but more like heterodox stuff, like analysis, which I guess is also pretty like male oriented, but that is like I guess sort of like I international relations sort of stuff was something I was like very interested in, but I ultimately settled on sort of doing programming. Um, I
yeah,
do sort of want to sort of meet more like cis women who are sort of into that, like, but there is like mostly like trans women who are sort of, and I kind of wish it was less so it would be like less of a stereotype, but it is something I'm good at, and it is something, which, um, that is my field, but.
yeah. And I understand not wanting to not fit into a stereotype, but
Mhm.
stereotypes exist because they're generally true.
Definitely. I guess my thing is I don't there's like a sort of other characteristics sort of associated with the stereotype, which is generally sort of like male, I guess,
Like the
behaviorally.
incel sort of vibe.
Um, I don't know if that's do you think that's true?
Well, I, I guess I should just let you continue talking and say which aspect of
I suppose
maleness.
not like in sort of like highly sort of like aggressive sort of male spaces. Like there's like the strategy games too. And I do feel sort of like cheated into like the strategy game sort of like genre because I did originally sort of get into it because there was like a guy that I was friends with, and I did sort of like start playing so like I could play multiplayer games with them, but um, I do feel kind of cheated into that, but it is what it is, I suppose. But like I don't know, sorts of like that, high, like sort of aggressive, sort of male, I guess, sort of like vibe that you see from a lot of these types of like autogenophiles. It's not something I want to be associated with, but there is like, in terms of like interest, I suppose that is something I'm sort of into. Um,
Yeah. How do you when you look to your future, um, what do you anticipate?
So I sort of touched upon this at the beginning of the interview, but I do sort of I have sort of like expressed, I guess, like a desire to sort of socially sort of detransition and sort of retransition when not unable to pass as a man, because sort of being in that like kind of clockable, but like and that is something that's like a bit unnerving because like I do sort of see how sort of people speak about like autosexuals online, and that is something I don't that's not something I really want to be sort of associated with. I don't imagine sort of dating as like an auto Gina, because like that is like a thing for me. I guess I want I'm not like actively dating, but like being in a that is something that would sort of bring me joy. I don't imagine that'd be particularly better as like a man with like who's like extremely gender non-conforming, I guess. But like I would sort of like to I get but in terms of like, the fear of being judged by others for, being openly sort of like feminine. I don't really dress like I would, going into like you see with like a lot of like trans women, dress normally as they would, as you'd see someone dress going into like a sex club or whatever. But like that's sort of like a lot of people sort of like talk about, that kind of behavior from which I don't know. I sort of get the vibe that, people like generally are kind of disgusted by you if you're, autosexual, which is something I sort of, feel the need to sort of hide from everyone. Um, there was something else I want. It sort of escapes me, but
Do you think you would try?
oh, I
Yeah.
remember now. I think in terms of like a sort of the sort of fantasy future as like a woman, I have kind of talked about kind of, but it's like the idea that, when I'm sort of going to sleep, when I'm sort of on the edge there and I'm like really sort of like hoping and praying that, I become like a real woman or something like that. Sort of I don't know. The way I sort of feel it is as if like I'm sort of catching glimpses of like another life that I can just sort of fall into if I have like the willpower to think hard enough or if I just like believe hard enough. Well, that is like sort of a delusion, but that is sort of like just like I guess an instinctual sort of feeling I get. And I guess in that I do sort of imagining going on like sort of like are you familiar with like Lol Cow Farm and like Crystal Cafe and that sort of thing
Um, is this just sort of like Kiwi Farms, but
for
different?
women? It's like Kiwi Farms and 4chan, but for like women, if that makes
Oh,
it's
oh,
yeah,
geez.
they're like really turfy too, which I do like sort of lurk on there, but I don't know. I sort of imagine my life and it's sort of like the inverse of sort of what I've led, which would be like online sort of but that is sort of the thing I imagine. But I guess like sort of like in terms of like idealized futures, I would hope that I'm sort of like more sort of well adjusted. Um in like this hypothetical, where I do feel more complete. I suppose that'd be more well adjusted. That I have like sort of normative sorts of like experiences and desires, but that I guess that's not something that sort of like comes naturally. I suppose. Um, and I do sort of imagine sort of like aging as a woman and sort of like hitting those sorts of like major life milestones as a woman, but I sort of have to. I do feel like coming to accept with the conclusion that like emotionally sort of accept that that isn't something that's like real. That's like a delusion, I guess. Is something that's like kind of important that I go through.
You mean milestones as in, so like motherhood?
Yeah, motherhood, marriage, just like aging.
Yeah. Is Are there any other do you have any other thoughts you'd like to touch on while we're talking?
There was something I thought about a bit of like a bit back. It does escape me right now, though. What I I don't know. I do feel as though, like, sort of, I think, sort of like, I guess for me, my sort of, I do sort of feel as though, I guess when I was initially sort of getting into sort of the Blanchardist, my understanding was like I sort of feel as though like sort of Serrano's gender identity model and like Blanchard's sort of typology is two sort of ways at like describing the same phenomenon. because like a lot of the time when sort of Blanchardist sort of typology gets described, it's like describing specific psychological mechanisms, which ultimately I feel like do sort of lead to the same place. And I feel like the issue with sort of Serrano's model is that it's like it kind of gives you the false impression that like you're sort of are already a woman and that there's sort of no additional sort of learning that you have to do, which I don't think like serves a lot of people who do want to assimilate well. And I think it's sort of bad for society in that you do have these people with sort of like male oriented personalities who sort of go into like private spaces and that sort of thing, which I guess I'm not like sort of eliminationist on that front, except for like no, not even on sports, because I think for sports it's like you have people who do like transition really young, uh, who are like I don't know, because like the who sort of don't get that male sort of pubertal development, who sort of probably do fit in there, but you have people who sort of, have gone through that who probably don't. But I do feel that sort of like there are medical associations there who like, or like the specific like regulatory organizations for sports, like are probably best for like judging that. But I do feel like that there's this sort of like I feel like people your or AGPs would be sort of better served if like they sort of understood where they sort of come from, I guess, and that they're having sort of this like feminine identity isn't necessarily at odds with like the idea that you're sort of are like I guess biologically sort of like a man, and that you sort of fallen in love with like this feminine sort of persona. Um,
Yeah. Has it been helpful for you to know about autogynephilia?
I suppose so, because like I guess there's like the whole sort of like I'm not like true trans. I guess I'm not like I'm not. I did because like I didn't really feel before like I was actually a woman. I kind of felt like that's something I wanted to be, and that's something I was sort of like um that's something I sort of like wanted to be, and that's something I sort of idealized and sort of was attracted to like this identity, I guess. But like I feel like I don't fully accept because like I do still have those delusions, I guess, on the edge of sleep, those sorts of like instinctual, sort of emotional types of things. Like if I like hope hard enough, if I will sort of fall into that other life, um, which I obviously isn't like real. I guess, but I guess from like sort of starting on this sort of journey to sort of understand myself, why it has sort of like made me feel sort of less shameful about sort of because like I think the idea that like people who are sort of more dysphoric, analytic, and people who sort of have more mild sort of those we all exist on like the same sorts of spectrums, that that sort of like in my mind sort of unlocked, I'm able to sort of relate to these people without feeling like I'm some like because like there are sort of aspects of that experience, like I did have like sort of early on like this sort of like um you know when I was like first cross dressing, I guess, when I sort of decided, I guess, that's that sort of shame with like the, I guess, initial sort of like sexual excitement. Like obviously that to me, like that was something, I'm not like I wasn't like that's something that happened, but at the time I felt like it was kind of gross. Um like obvious, it wasn't wasn't something and it like I did truly feel like wrong body, and like because like that is sort of a lie that like your autoandrophobia will tell you. I did truly feel like that like wrong body, and like I this is sort of a life I want to have, but there's also that sort of shame which like I couldn't really fit into that that model, I guess. But like sort of being able to like understand that sort of I'm on a spectrum with like these other people who, might be more sort of, they might have like purely sort of sexual motivations for this, or like people, and like also people who sort of are analerotic, not interested in other people. Because I would sort of consider myself on like the A spectrum, I guess. I feel like all autosexuals are to some extent. Um, but being able to sort of relate to all these people and sort of like understand like parts of their experience are also my experience has something, that's sort of demystified, who I am.
And what would you, for like the AGPs that are listening, what would you want them to know?
Would AGPs that are sort of on the fence or non-believers or sort of bought in?
I think there'll be a selection effect where the ones that already know their AGP are going to listen to this.
Okay. Um, I mean, I suppose, if you're sort of, obviously I do feel like there is sort of a gap in sort of understanding with like a lot of gender critical people, and obviously there are like a lot of like women who have bad experiences, and I don't blame them because like there are a lot of people who do sort of act objectionably. But I think like sort of like um demystifying, I suppose, for yourself, like being able to like understand, you are part of like this broader community. Um, and like there is, I feel like, more sort of like understanding, I feel, that needs to be communicated to people, and I think it's important that people sort of share their experiences, so it isn't, the experience isn't purely thought of as like a fetishistic, when it's not, it's like a love of women, and a love of yourself. um,
Yeah, I
I,
agree.
I did remember what I was going to say previously. It was about like dating.
And what was that?
Yeah, so I guess I'd sort of like, I thought I said asexual, and like that's sort of what, but basically I think for me, or like for, sort of like a lot of, I feel like a lot of like sort of autosexuals are going to, or especially those who aren't GAMP, because like GAMP is like such a huge, there's like T for T is big for a reason, and it's like the sort of preferred, um, sort of pairing for a reason. But I do think things can get pretty hard for if you're like not GAMP and you're sort of cut out for that. But I do think there's sort of, something special, I think, does happen between like AGP, like, that sort of analerotic younger cohort of AGPs and like that sort of cohort of like autoandrophiles. Some I feel like something special, from like what I've heard from others, something special does like really happen there, where there's like that attraction there, and I do sort of feel like I guess, I don't know what it's like. There's that sort of understanding, but it's, you aren't sort of suffering from the same sorts of things. Um, I guess,
Are you talking about between AAPs and AGPs?
yeah, I think something special happens there.
Yeah, like that it's a viable matchmaking option.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know. I do feel I kind of hope for like one day there's sort of like an easier way for like these sorts of people to meet, where like, AGPs who are sort of like GAMP are sort of sorted with each other, and you have sort of like AAPs and like AGPs, or, because like it is like fairly hard, to sort of find people you connect with, as like an AGP. But
Yeah, that's part of the path of being a sexual minority, I think.
I
Uh,
agree.
but it'll help once more people understand how to spot the AGPs and AAPs. I think they'll be able to find each other better.
Yeah, I don't know. Because like I feel like for a lot of sort of other groups, or like I feel like, so I did done like this analysis on like sort of the options, I guess, for, like if you're, autosexual, I guess, and you're looking to date women. I also did this sort of thing with men, but I feel like men mostly boils down to, uh, GAMP guys, guys with low disgust, and like um, guys who are sort of like eggs, or I don't like egg culture, but like guys who are sort of like on the cusp of being like a GAMP themselves. But for women, I feel like it's you have four like kind of cohorts. You have like bi women, you have like straight women who are into that sort of like trap mode, I guess. And I'm not doing like the lesbians like dick thing, but you do have like a minority of sort of like female, exclusively like gynophilic women who either have like low disgust responses or like are like have like a specific paraphilic attraction to like GAMP, I guess.
Right.
Um,
Or their AAP.
yeah, I'd include AAP as like the fourth sort of because you do have like bi women and like sort of that like third group in there. Um, but I don't know. I feel like out of those, if you're like analerotic, most of like that sort of like and you're sort of disgusted with like heterosexual I guess sex. I got that bi most of that like sort of bi women cohort is like out for you. Like almost all of that like sort of straight women cohort who are like into that like trap mode, those are all out for you, and that sort of like specific like GAMP, those women who like lesbians who are like have a specific paraphilic interest in like GAMP are also sort of like out for you. Um, so there is that sort of like whole analysis where I guess I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to mention before I close up recording?
I think that's most of my thoughts. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Well, yeah, thanks for taking the time to record this today.
Thanks for having me on.